Paul's actually done a great intro into the importance of area-wide management for Queensland fruit fly, so I'm going to try and go through as quickly as I can, because I'm sure you've all managed Queensland fruit fly in some way, shape or form on your enterprises or as part of your work. One of the things that Paul pointed out there was crop hygiene, and so that's the specific area that I'm going to be focusing on today. It's one of the many things that we need to do for Queensland fruit fly management. So we have the problem of fruit waste. No matter how much we try and reduce the production of this waste fruit or find alternative markets for certain quality of waste fruit, there's always going to be an element of production that's going to be completely waste fruit. It can't be used for anything else. We've got trade protocol requirements that usually insist that the fruit that is waste is to be removed off of the property. And that's all the trade protocol says. So I'm starting to work with growers to find out what that means and how they can be able to better manage that fruit waste. Larger enterprises can dedicate a cool room to freezing their waste fruit before it then can be dumped on the property. Smaller growers can't necessarily do this, and we also don't expect waste fruit to be put into the same cool room as fruit for sale. Stock food is a solution for some of the waste fruit, but then we've got the issue of the transportation of potentially infested fruit in that waste bucket. Smaller farms are often land poor, so they don't necessarily have a dedicated area to do deep burial, or they don't even have a good area to be able to dump any fruit even on top of the ground. The commercial waste fruit removal is actually quite expensive. So by this, I'm talking about your big dumpsters that you have at the front of your packing shed. And it is pest and disease best practice in general to remove your waste fruit. So there could be other pests and other diseases that also benefit from improving your on-farm hygiene. At the end of the day, the biggest issue is the cost of handling waste, because it does not pay the bills. So why do you need to spend more money on it? So part of the work that I've done in the area-wide management of Queensland fruit fly in the Yarra Valley is to investigate different options. And we started reading about how they deal with spotted wing Drosophila in the UK and looked at the management strategies they had for their waste fruit. So we built a scoping study with partnering with the Box Hill Institute of TAFE, the Biosecurity Centre of Excellence, and Mick Blake. And we looked at the suitability of different waste management strategies for managing fruit that's potentially infested with Queensland fruit fly. And this is really important for the Yarra Valley, because when I started work in the Yarra Valley, we had no Queensland fruit fly. And during the course of my employment and the projects that we've been doing, we've had incursions of fruit fly. So we've had to pretty much pivot from where we were heading to and deal with the problem at hand. So some of the things that we looked at was to work out what we're going to use as a fruit fly waste management strategy. We decided that we'd work towards fermentation, and I'll go through our options in the next slide. But essentially, Box Hill Institute were able to get some samples, they were able to rear them out, do some tests. We thought the fermentation was going to be a good plan, so the next part of the scoping study is actually to work out whether the farmers would adopt this process. So where we'll get to by the end of this presentation is that the farmers did like this process, and they've had some recommendations that they would like to see on how it's going to be upscaled in the future. So we looked at augmentoria, we looked at heat treatment, we looked at mulching the fruit with a rotary hoe or incorporating it back into the land. We looked at deep burial, and we looked at long-term cold storage. Some of these strategies are already in place, for example, heat treatment or cold storage. But what we needed to do was look at an energy-efficient option, one that cost the least amount of money and something that farmers could do with products that they have on hand. And that's how we got to fermentation. We felt it was achievable. We felt that it didn't necessarily increase the risk to the Yarra Valley if we did these on-farm trials in the Yarra Valley, because we have had the odd detection of Queensland fruit fly already. So some of the study outcomes over in the UK with Bethan, we've looked at the fermentation and what products or what implements you would then use to conduct this process. They found barrels to be fantastic for creating the fermentation, but difficult to handle. They found the large bin liners far too difficult to handle as well, and they ended up using plastic-lined bin crates. But what we needed to do first was determine whether that process was actually going to kill Queensland fruit fly. So at Box Hill, they were able to take some perfectly sound fruit from the Yarra Valley, take it to New South Wales and infest it with Queensland fruit fly. And we did this for strawberries and for raspberries. They were brought back to the Yarra Valley, and every now and again they would take samples out of both the control, which was just left to its own devices, and the actual trial, which was where we induced fermentation conditions. So we monitored things like temperature, oxygen reduction, or by default, carbon dioxide increase. We looked at alcohol to see if that might have had an impact. Obviously, we needed to know the sugar to see what conditions would be ideal for fermentation and how that would affect the alcohol production. And we also observed pH. To summarise the results that they were able to achieve at Box Hill Institute, the pH stayed fairly stable during the fermentation process, so we decided we could rule that out as a measure for the future. We observed that the sugar decreased and the alcohol increased. So we've got to look at what other factors were part of that fermentation. To summarise the laboratory results, they found very quickly that in raspberries, there was no Queensland fruit fly emergence in the fermentation vessel. Yet samples that were taken from the control fruit actually showed that some Queensland fruit flies emerged 7 to 10 days later. In the strawberry sample, it took a little bit longer for the fruit to break down, so it took a little bit longer for the fermentation to take effect in killing the Queensland fruit fly eggs and larvae that were in there. So in the control, they did get some fruit fly hatching out of what was left alone and not fiddled with, but after 2 days of fermentation, there was no Queensland fruit flies emerging as adults from the fermentation process. So how do we bring this back to industry? How do we get people to adopt this? So we decided to run some farm trials. We got some cider barrels. They were 60-litre barrels. We put taps on the bottom, carbon dioxide bubblers on the top. We put thermometers on the inside, and we took them out to see whether farmers would adopt this process. We tried to fit them to some shet pellets so that they could be easily transported from the shed and taken down to the paddock. And we also focused on some 200-litre barrels because instantly someone said, I can't do 60 litres, that's just a waste of my time. We wanted to be able to use tools that a farmer would already have on their property to be able to upscale or adapt or retrofit to something that they already run. So the strawberries did take a little while to break down, but you can see over the different days of how long stuff was left in there for, that there was significant degradation in the fruit. We didn't necessarily test for fruit fly survival because we never knew how many fruit fly, if there was any at all, in the original lot. It was the main part of this particular farm trial was just to see if farmers could adopt this process. We've already proven that it kills fruit fly in the trial beforehand. So I know this is a lot of text up here, and I don't normally put a lot of text in my presentations, but these are the direct quotes from the farmers that I surveyed after they've been through that process. So some really interesting feedback came out, and to summarise it was, I need a bigger vessel. I need to be able to deal with the different quantities of fruit that are coming through my packing shed. And mind you, this was only concentrating on waste that was already containerised. So we didn't talk about paddock waste, or the waste that gets dropped as you pick. A certain farmer said that there are certain times of the year that they would actually pick their waste and take it out, and there are other times of the year that he would leave the waste and drop it because the crop was about to end anyway. So this project only focused on waste that was already containerised or waste that could be containerised. One of the farmers actually said that next year he might add some elderberries and some yeast. So he'd like to actually work out if he can use it as a saleable product. The barrel size was good for some of the farmers, and they suggested that they might just introduce a third or a fourth barrel, so that if those fermentation processes were taking longer due to the cooler weather, or for some reason whatever was slowing that fermentation process down, they would like that added option. One farmer asked, is alcohol the better steriliser? Should they try and work this fermentation to increase the alcohol? A lot of farmers came back and said, as long as you keep it simple, I don't want to have to measure 4 or 5 things. And one of the farmers was talking to me during the feedback session. He said, well, if you could put something with a green light on top. So there's one for anyone out there doing some IT or development, can measure these parameters and have an easy system for a farmer to just walk by, all right, I've got to empty that next. And then I was speaking to one of the blokes, and he was telling me that he found it annoying to have to then go and shift this pulp down to the paddock. The idea of the tap being on the bottom is that you could get rid of some of the liquid volume on your way down to the paddock and only have to upend the remaining solid pulp in the rest of the barrel. This guy's idea was to actually add more water to it, increase the rate of fermentation with the strawberries, then get it so far degraded that you could actually just pump it out. So if he could flick a switch and have this body of fluid and pulp and dead fruit flies, if they're in there at all, if you could just have a pipe that goes down to the paddock and gets rid of it and doesn't have to shift it. So obviously we've got to make things a lot easier. So the project goals for fruit fly waste is that this is for the waste. There are so many other parts to area-wide management of fruit fly that this is only one small part of it, but hopefully it can make everyone's life easier and having to deal with fruit fly, because getting rid of that risk of the fruit fly carrying over from one season to the other or one crop to the next, we have to really work hard on that. Obviously selling the waste or selling the second grade fruit is the best option, but we do need an option that can be upscaled very quickly. It needs to be able to use items on hand, as I mentioned before. We need to be able to provide a how-to so that producers can easily go and take this science and make it a practical thing that they do. We could hopefully try and define a single parameter that actually causes the death, and that way we'd only need to measure one thing. We could make it simple to be used. We'd like to upscale this trial and switch it over to 1,000-litre shuttles. Hopefully we could use a bit more water and integrate that pump idea. I think that there's a lot more scope in here to do some more research in here, because if this practice is already happening overseas for spotted ring Drosophila, if and when spotted ring Drosophila comes to our country, we've got a process in our management strategies already that not only deals with a current pest, but we have the potential to make sure we're ahead of the game on dealing with a future exotic threat. I'm done.
I'll give you a gift now so you can hold on to it while you're answering your questions. Sure. We do have time for questions with this presentation. Can I just start off with one while we get the microphone down from the back? Yeah, we need the microphone, unless everyone can hear. Can people just put the waste into the container at once and then seal it? That you can't open it shut because the flies would come out?
Yeah, that's the game, is to put all your waste in there. At the end of the day, lock it down. That fermentation starts to take place, and then the next packing day you'd work on the second vessel. So it's about locking it down and letting it go through that fermentation process.
So you'd have multiple containers going, yep. Yep, question back there.
Have you done any nutrient analysis on the stuff you're pumping out? Because it's going to be pretty nutrient rich, you'd think, and you can't just go out and dump that straight undiluted onto a paddock.
I have to agree with you there. No, we haven't done any nutrient analysis, but the comparison we were making was between a farmer that was already dumping it on the ground versus treating it first before they dump it on the ground. But I do agree, it's a very valid question, and a lot of international studies are showing about even the management of waste and that nutrient-rich pressure that puts in the ground. So I agree it needs to be done.
Anyone else need a